Hi all, welcome to today's panel discussion. It's titled Strained Cooperation or a Final Rupture, China-US Relations Amidst a Global Pandemic. I'm so glad you could join us today. And I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists, Dr. David Arase, Dr. David Bulman, and Dr. Adam Webb. After my introductions of each panelist, they will each make opening comments. Once all the speakers have concluded their comments, we will open the floor to a moderated Q&A. During the Q&A session, I will read aloud the question and our panelists will respond. To ask a question, you will see a chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse at the bottom of your screen, it will say Q&A. If at any point you have a question for a specific panelist or for the panel in general, please type your question into the box and click submit. Questions can be submitted at any time during opening comments or during Q&A. You can choose to submit anonymously or to include your name. I do request that you specify who on the panel you are addressing your question to, or if you are addressing the panel in general. So our first speaker today is Dr. David Arase. Dr. Arase serves as the resident professor of international politics at the Hopkins Nanjing Center. I'm excited to have Dr. Arase here with us today as he brings his unique perspective as a researcher of East Asia with him. His research interests range across the East Asian region, and his most recent publications explore the many ways Japan achieves its foreign policy goals in an increasingly competitive economic region. Dr. Arase has developed a distinctly Indo-Pacific regional perspective, providing us an interesting lens through which to view the region. He has also written on China, specifically in his 2016 book, The Rise of China, Implications for East Asian Order. His perspective is further enriched by his travel throughout the East Asia and Indo-Pacific region. Just this past year, Dr. Arase presented at conferences from Singapore and Goa all the way to Tokyo. His new monograph, The Future of Governance in the Indo-Pacific, is forthcoming this summer. As an alumnus of Johns Hopkins SAIS from the class of 1982, we are honored to have Dr. Arase join us today from Hong Kong, where he has been visiting the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong since early March. Today, he will discuss how China-US relations are viewed in the East Asia region, or better yet, in the Indo-Pacific region. Our second speaker today is Dr. David Bulman. Dr. Bulman currently serves as the Jill McGovern and Stephen Muller Assistant Professor of International Affairs and China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He also serves as the Director of the Pacific Community Initiative, which has tasked itself with exploring ways to institutionalize the US-China relationship in the Asia-Pacific region. It seems only fitting for him to join us today, as it is stated on the website of the PCI that part of the initiative's mission is to foster cooperation in the region in the face of unprecedented geopolitical change. The initiative is a partnership between Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Institute for International and Strategic Studies at Peking University, and receives funding from the China-US Exchange Foundation. Before becoming director of the Pacific Community Initiative, Dr. Bulman served as a staff economist for the World Bank. The combination of his experience and research interests provide much needed insights into topics such as international development bank projects and the unique aspects of China's local governance practices. As a current faculty member and an alumnus of SAIS, we are excited to welcome Dr. Bulman to our panel today. I hope his comments will provide us with insights into the dynamics of peace in the East Asian region and both the short and long-term obstacles to lasting peace between China and the United States. Now, our third panelist is Dr. Adam K. Webb. Dr. Webb currently serves as co-director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center. His research interests cut broadly across political thought, globalization, and critiques of modernity. He has also engaged topics connected with politics on the ground, including social movements, alternative development, and public opinion on cosmopolitanism and the rise of China. He brings an international perspective to HNC and Sino-American relations, including fieldwork in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. He is currently completing a book project laying out a traditional pluralist vision of future global constitutional order. Today, he will be considering to what extent the pandemic marks an inflection point in US-China relations. as far as the relative standing of either country or the nature of international cooperation. As the co-director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, Dr. Webb has a unique perspective to offer on joint Chinese and American educational cooperation. And while not an alumnus of SAIS, he has been at the HNC since 2008, and we are certainly excited to have him here today. So now that I've introduced everyone, we are very excited. We'll begin with Dr. Arase's comments, followed by Dr. Bulman, and then Dr. Webb. Each person is allotted 15 minutes, and if some may take more, some may take less. And if we go over 15, I'll give a wave or a nod. And great. So without further ado, Dr. Arase, you have the floor.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for the generous, over-generous introduction. So because I'm in Hong Kong and because Trump, I guess Friday afternoon, made an announcement about his willingness to revoke Hong Kong's independent trade status, I'll just say a few words about Hong Kong first, and then move on to talk about how U.S.-China relations are viewed in the region, in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll try to take 10 minutes or so. So first of all, with respect to Hong Kong, I'm at the University of Hong Kong right now, and the response is, a mixture of, anger, dismay, and maybe even some despair at this development from the National People's Congress. So the NPC bypassed Hong Kong's legislature to enact the national security legislation. And the reason why it's so dismaying is that, to the people of Hong Kong, is that it criminalizes anything deemed harmful to the interests or dignity or authority of Beijing. And it also allows mainland domestic security agencies to operate openly in Hong Kong and in order to ensure enforcement of the law. So this is why Trump, and you may have heard in the news, Trump announced that he's willing to revoke Hong Kong's independent trade status. And this move is very consequential, but at the same time, he didn't really announce any concrete measures. And it's not the worst he could have done. All right, so I have a few comments about this. First of all, Hong Kong really is not focused on trade. It's more of a financial center. So, removing Hong Kong's independent trade status is not that big a deal. But, the perception of Hong Kong could really change because, Hong Kong is a hub for global corporations and banks, and it's also a great destination for tourists because it's perceived to be a safe place under the rule of British common law. And if it's perceived that Hong Kong is no longer under the rule of law, this could really affect its future. Now, the worst thing Trump could have done is to do things that would have affected Hong Kong's ability to be a window to the dollar-based global financial system, but he didn't really go there. So I guess that's good news. Now, with respect to the Indo-Pacific, the wider region and how the U.S. and China are viewed, my guess is that most Americans don't realize it, but both China and the U.S. today are suffering a loss of stature from this whole COVID-19 episode, and also because the rest of the region really looks to these two countries for leadership, and the two countries are really not providing it. They're so preoccupied with their strategic competition, and so it's very disconcerting and dismaying for the rest of the region. Now, so I'd have to say, with referring back to the title of this seminar, we're well past the point of strained cooperation between the U.S. and China, and I think we're pretty much at the point where we could see final rupture somewhere, looming on the horizon, but it's still some distance away, and it's avoidable. Now, one thing that's pretty clear to everybody is that this COVID-19 episode has tipped U.S.-China relations into open hostility. And so we're now entering a new period where we're going to have, just pretty much open information, legal and psychological warfare going on, particularly through the media, through diplomatic channels and in international organizations. And then also we see a marked increase in military posturing in contested strategic areas, most visibly around Taiwan, and of course in the East China Sea and South China Sea. But China is also involved in aggressive moves in these past several weeks against its neighbors as well: Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and India. And of course, this is in addition to Hong Kong. So this sort of change on the part of China to a much more, across the board aggressive stance is very disconcerting. Now, what this means is that this brings us closer to some kind of accidental conflict, because both sides are posturing, right? The U.S. and China are posturing more in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. And in my view, there won't be a final rupture in an actual full-on Cold War until there's some kind of kinetic conflict between the U.S. and China. And there's reason to hope that this won't happen, because I don't believe that China intends to start a war. I think its strategy is meant to sort of remain below the threshold of armed conflict. So if armed conflict does happen, it will be the result of an accident or miscalculation. Now, in any case, this new great power competition in the region will be limited or conditioned by new realities in the region. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, the leadership capacity and the leadership vision of both China and the U.S. are really doubted in the region. Nobody really has a lot of faith in either country. And nobody really wants to destroy or dismantle all the good things that globalization has brought. The digital and trade connectivity. This is what everybody wants to preserve. Now, in addition, in the region, there's a good number of pretty capable middle and small powers. And they're actually in a position to limit and moderate the behavior of the two great powers. So it's up to them right now. They have to kind of step up. And then finally, what gives me the most hope is that I can see at HNC this much maligned generation of millennials, right? They generally want to build an open, cooperative, and peaceful world community, and so I place a lot of hope in them. So that's it. Those are my opening comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we'll just segue right into Dr. Bulman.
Great. Thanks so much. I hope you can hear me here. Thanks to Ben and Amanda and all the other organizers for inviting me to speak today. When we think about how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting international relations and the US-China relationship, the effect on travel itself and on people-to-people exchange should not be overlooked or underestimated. I'm speaking to you now from a lonely room in the United States, but I was actually scheduled to be spending a week in residence at HNC right now, where I was very eager to have the opportunity to teach a short course and meet students and faculty. In March, I was supposed to have brought a group of SAIS and HNC students to Wuhan to study local government support for innovation. Obviously, that didn't happen either. So it's great that Zoom enables us to meet virtually still, but these virtual sessions are, of course, a poor excuse for the real thing. So I'm very much looking forward to when I can actually engage with other students and professors, again, particularly from HNC. And one thing that Zoom does for me is it makes it much more difficult to give a talk where I can't see reactions from everyone I'm speaking to, which leads me to have a much more formal presentation than I would like to have. So that's a warning to all of you. So we've been asked today to discuss how the ongoing global pandemic is affecting international relations, especially in the context of China's rise, America's decline, and the Thucydides Trap narrative. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll talk about the current dismal state of bilateral relations and the likely effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on this relationship moving forward. And I'll conclude by returning to the idea of the Thucydides Trap and a discussion of why and how we need to keep open and improve avenues for bilateral cooperation in these difficult times. So let's start with the current state of the bilateral relationship. I don't want to dwell too much on this because the short answer is that things are really bad and they're getting worse on nearly all fronts. I think it's probably now safe to say that the US-China relationship has not been this bad since normalization. Rather than list all of the ways that tensions have increased over the past few years and all these root causes, let me highlight simply 4 representative developments from just the past week, or maybe 2. So first, in terms of scholarly and student exchange, there are new visa restrictions for Chinese graduate students and scholars with any connection to PLA or so-called military civil fusion institutions. And there's proposed legislation by Cotton, Blackburn, and Kustoff from a few days ago that would block all Chinese students in STEM fields. Second, the tech war is of course heating up, as last week the US Commerce Department issued a ban on foreign manufacturers using US chipmaking gear from selling to Huawei. Third, the US is now openly exploring new moves in a financial war, including Chinese firm delistings from US stock exchanges, market index, and public pension fund divestments from China, and potential sanctions on Chinese banks. Trump referred obliquely to these moves in his press conference yesterday. This is, of course, getting lots of press in China, given the continued dominance of the US dollar and current yuan weakness. And fourth, the possible end of Hong Kong's special status for trade and customs, as Professor Arase talked about. So things are not looking good as we enter the 5th month of the global pandemic. Yet in explaining these current tensions, I'm not sure how much should yet be attributed to the coronavirus itself. Bilateral tensions have been getting worse for years, partially for structural reasons, but more importantly as a result of greater aggressiveness and repression in Xi's China, stalled economic reforms in China, and of course Trump's haphazard and deals-based approach to foreign policy. When we look at current US actions targeting China, the ones I just mentioned, I don't believe things are significantly worse yet than the pre-coronavirus trends would have indicated. That said, it's already clear that COVID is and will be a global shock of epic proportions, further shaking the global order as it disrupts economic and political developments throughout the world. Although the pandemic's medium and long-term consequences remain unknown and will depend, of course, on how the virus continues to develop in all of our countries, some contours of what will emerge are becoming clearer. The most apparent short-term consequences appear to be an increased likelihood that the bilateral relationship will get much worse before it gets better. The global economic recession will make China less capable of meeting US demands in a phase 1 trade deal, which could then lead to the reimposition and ratcheting up of tariffs. The US is not likely to ease off during an election cycle, and already the accusations and recriminations from DC and from China's wolf warrior diplomats have marked a new low. But the deep challenge that the coronavirus presents is the effect it will have on global order in the coming decade. Is this the nail in the coffin of US global leadership, and will China rise out of the American ashes, or will a more multipolar and more disconnected world emerge? I think this latter possibility is considerably more likely. Let's start by noting that the biggest shock to American global leadership right now, including during the pandemic, comes from American failures and not from China's rise. There have been several shocks over the past 2 decades, of course. In particular, the global financial crisis undermined trust in Western capitalism and inspired many countries and many people within the US to look for a new model. China supposedly, and in many ways self-congratulatorily, went from student to teacher as it stalled liberalization and doubled down on state capitalism and forms of techno-industrial policy. More recently, hopes that the US still harbored ambitions of real global leadership and the provision of global public goods have been shattered as the Trump administration has turned away from international treaties, institutions, and allies, all undermining faith in US commitments. And of course, China has taken advantage of the emerging international vacuum. For instance, it now runs 4 of the 15 specialized UN agencies, while the US runs only 1. These are wholly domestically driven developments in the US, which weaken the US and undermine US ability to shape China's international and thus also in some ways domestic behavior. As it currently looks, the pandemic will further advance perceptions of US decline. The US has not taken global leadership during the crisis, instead cutting funding and now planning to withdraw from the WHO entirely, as per Trump's press conference yesterday, and also trying to outbid our own allies for PPE. The domestic economic costs could, of course, linger for years. It's obviously possible that a systemic shock of this scale will impel the American people to unite in reforming aspects of our economic and political model, shoring up America's dominant global position, but I'm not holding my breath. As I was talking with Ben before this session, it's very tough to be optimistic in these times. So I do think that the crisis further undermines US global leadership. But the question is, has China risen commensurately? Will China emerge from the pandemic crisis as a stronger nation? Are the wolf warrior diplomats who pick fights and promote this new arrogance around the world effective? It may be too early to confidently tell, but signs thus far to me look to signal a weaker China with a worse international reputation and growing economic vulnerability. So let's take these in turn quickly. China's early mishandling of the virus and the initial cover-up have hurt its global reputation. Aggressive diplomacy and the buying of support through politically contingent PPE exports have not been well received globally, to put it lightly, nor has China's recent approach to Hong Kong. And although China's handling of the virus since late January has been quite effective, this effectiveness itself, I think, is limited in the eyes of many who don't trust China's data, either rightly or wrongly, and is also undermined by the similar or greater effectiveness in controlling the virus in Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, and others, which are fully democratic states that make a joke of arguments that the authoritarian nature of China's regime was the key factor in China's success. And China also faces a huge reputational risk right now as developing country debt comes due, particularly in many BRI recipient countries. China is stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Aggressive bilateral negotiations on this debt will harm China's reputation in developing Asia and Africa. But at the same time, billions of dollars of debt forgiveness would be a massive blow to increasingly weak financial system that may soon have its own trouble raising dollars and accessing dollar payment systems. So although the US has taken a reputational hit, China has as well. One indication of this is a recent German poll I saw from the Korber Foundation, which shows that although 77% of Germans surveyed said that their opinion of the US has declined during the pandemic, 36% also said their opinion of China had declined. But the most important determinant of China's medium-term reputation and global soft power, and then also hard power, will be the resilience and future growth of China's economy. A common view in the US right now seems to be that China is going to emerge from this crisis economically stronger than ever, at least in relative terms. This view seems pretty common in policymaking circles as well. I agree with a recent article I saw by Daniel Dresner, who recently wrote that the thought underlying all US anxiety about China is that China's model of political economy might simply be superior to America's. Such an anxiety, I believe, can explain why Marco Rubio last year put out a policy document responding to Made in China 2025 that basically called for the US to study industrial policy in China and copy it for domestic implementation. I see plenty of problems with America's economic system, but that said, I see more problems with the sustainability of China's economic system. And I think we exaggerate China's economic strength at our peril. First, we need to remind ourselves that China is still a middle-income country and that the transition to high income is very difficult. As Li Keqiang reminded us 2 days ago, China still has 600 million or more people who earn less than 1,000 renminbi a month. Rural health and education inequality make it simply arithmetically impossible for China to have a level of education and human capital in its workforce in 20 or 30 years that is at all comparable to advanced country numbers today. And my own research shows that innovation itself is not truly a path to economic growth for middle-income countries. China needs creative destruction. It needs to let inefficient zombie firms fail and agile new firms take their place, but its political system and priorities prevent that from happening at scale. In the past, the US has similarly fretted about the rise of the Soviet command economy model and the Japanese development state model, but then the Soviet Union declined as a consequence of failed economic reforms in the 70s and 80s that couldn't shift Soviet growth from capital-intensive labor surplus growth towards productivity growth. In Japan, demographic factors and a rapid productivity decline slowed the economy since the 80s. Structurally, China's model and the challenges it faces are remarkably similar to these two cases. China is getting old before it gets rich. Over the next 30 years, its working age population will fall by 210 million people, which is more than the entire working age population of the US today. And many estimates show that in China, total factor productivity growth, which is a measure of the sort of component of GDP growth that's not accounted for by capital and labor accumulation, has become zero or even negative over the past decade. Basically, China in recent years has grown only through increasingly inefficient investment based on increasing leverage, and this model cannot continue indefinitely. The NPC government work report last week highlights the CCP Zone Concerns, I think. The key takeaway for me reading the document is that the government is terrified of increasing and sustained unemployment. The GDP growth target has finally and usefully been ditched, but stabilizing employment has risen to the fore, with the urban job creation target front and center. In the work report itself, the word employment shows up 40 times, more often than the term pandemic. And Xi's new favorite terms for the CCP's key areas of focus are the 6 fronts, the Liu Wen, and the 6 areas, the Liu Bao. And the first priority in both of these lists of 6 is employment or job security. And this makes sense because if unofficial estimates of unemployment in China, not the official estimates, which never rise really above the low 6s, now range as high as 20%. And today, migrants do not have the same access to land and agriculture as a fallback as they did in 2008, given the increased renting of land, of rural land. When, in 2008, between 20 and 40 million rural urban migrants returned home. Furthermore, the government toolkit is more limited than it's been in the past, as China still has not dealt with the debt explosion created during the global financial crisis. I've been impressed so far by the fortitude and patience of China's policymakers in resisting the old playbook. But as unemployment concerns rise and manufacturing output remains stuck at 80 to 90% of capacity, I think we're seeing increasing signs that the old infrastructure debt stimulus model is again on the horizon. The risks of this approach, I believe, to be considerable, and the returns are likely limited. Economic and employment vulnerability in China, I think, also leads to potential political vulnerability and potential social instability, making China weaker, not stronger. I actually believe that the push to crush dissent in Hong Kong right now is a reflection of this, meaning to serve as a signal to any domestic forces who might seek to protest rising unemployment and economic loss. It's a forceful reminder that the CCP is in charge, global public opinion be damned. So let me try to summarize what I've covered so far and then conclude. US-China relations are as bad as they've been since the Mao era, when the US, of course, suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties in proxy wars with China. The pandemic did not by any means create this bilateral conflict, but it seems to be accelerating it. The pandemic has served as a further blow to US global leadership, but it is far from clear that China can capitalize on this given its own reputational hit and its growing economic vulnerabilities. So with this in mind, let me return briefly to the Thucydides Trap that was in our initial blurb for the event. Simply put, I do not find the Thucydides Trap logic to be very compelling. I subscribe much more to the theory that when great powers decline, the most important causes are internal, not external, rather than that rising powers and declining powers must wage war. Allison himself found that over the past 500 years, there have been 16 cases of rising powers that challenge ruling powers, with war breaking out in fully 12 of those cases. I don't want to get into a debate on the merits of each individual case, but it's important to note that most of these cases took place prior to the nuclear age. Only 2 took place post-World War II, and neither resulted in war, and none took place with as much economic interdependence and integration as today. That's of course not to say that China and the US could not go to war, but I don't think the current tensions in the relationship were structurally inevitable. Rather, several key junctures and decisions led to growing distrust and a breakdown in cooperation. And history being one damn thing after another like it is, I think many slightly altered events and slightly altered personalities could have led to a much more cooperative world today. Yet here we are. So today, even if the US and China are not destined to hot war, they seem more and more destined to some form of Cold War. This being the case, what should the US approach be to China? One approach, and clearly the one favored by Trump and seemingly also by Biden now, is to heat things up. The Trump game plan is to tweet China in capital letters with exclamation points, as he literally did yesterday morning, and to argue that Biden would be soft. As Peter Navarro has said, this election is going to be a referendum on China. But the current crisis, I think, shows the cost of the breakdown in cooperation between our two countries. Greater cooperation in health could potentially have saved tens of thousands of American lives. Beginning in 2017, as we know, the US CDC reduced its staff from nearly 50 to only 14 people, which included the loss of many epidemiologists. And at the same time, the USAID and the NSF offices in Beijing both closed as well. A world with no clear superpower and with the two largest powers increasingly hostile is also not one that facilitates global development. My last travel to Asia before the pandemic struck was to Singapore in January, where I organized a conference on US-China relations with experts from around the region. One key takeaway was that Singapore and other ASEAN countries do not want to choose between the US and China. Yet they worry that security and economic and technological trends right now are moving towards that point of decision. So I still believe that more engagement and cooperation remains in both countries' interests and in the world's interests. And I believe that as our countries move apart and normal modes of communication, exchange, and cooperation break down, we need to, of course, invest more resources in the remaining channels for dialogue. And we need to use our regional and global partners to help bind us into mutually beneficial rules, norms, and institutions. So let me just conclude by noting that I joined the faculty at SAIS 3 years ago, as Ben mentioned, with an additional responsibility as the director of the Pacific Community Initiative. This initiative was itself based on Henry Kissinger's ideas for building a community that would bind the US and China together and increase trust. Now, after 3 years, we're hoping to move the project forward, but with much less ambition. Rather than trying to formally build a community, we're now looking at how regional partners can help to maintain some degree of US-China cooperation in this new time of disintegration. The project may have to be retitled, something along the lines of Building for a Better Day, but we're open to more catchy titles than that. As we move forward, interactions between China and the US will become fewer and more hostile. There will be fewer overseas students, there will be less scientific and scholarly exchange, and there will be less policy coordination. In this environment, those of us on this webinar now and speaking today who travel back and forth and understand each other and work with each other become more important. For the Pacific community itself, the ties we've developed with scholars in China at Beida and other top universities are themselves probably the most important outcome of the project, and they're especially so compared to the initial stages of the initiative. And finally, in these times, I think the role of SAIS and of HNC in educating and providing avenues for dialogue between Chinese and American students is increasingly valuable. So let me stop there, and I look forward to questions. I'm sorry for running a little long.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much. All right, well, Dr. Webb, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thanks. So I don't think anyone would deny that the pandemic is a generational moment of sorts, and that in some ways it will obviously make a deep impression on people. I think it's also true that rather like turning on a light, it can illuminate an existing landscape, and it may even throw some features of that landscape into sharper relief. But at the same time, I think we should be careful not to overstate how transformative it will really be in itself once things settle down after a few months or a year or two. More precisely, I think one can make a stronger case that the pandemic may accelerate some social and economic and cultural trends that were already lurking. But if we try and projection the pandemic onto supposed big shifts in global order and the patterns of international cooperation, I think that becomes a lot more problematic. This idea that the pandemic marks an inflection point in relations between America and China is the key example that this panel is dealing with. And frankly, I think it's overstated, at least in the versions that we often hear nowadays. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to distill this claim of an inflection point in US-China relations into 3 different claims. Not everyone is making all of these claims at the same time, but they are common enough, and they involve some understandings of cause and effect that are worth untangling. So these claims are, number one, that the economic and social disruption of the pandemic is hitting the West much harder than China, and that the crisis and its aftermath will deal a further blow to American hegemony at exactly the time when the Trump administration is already retreating from global leadership. Number two, that the Chinese political model is acquitting itself well in the pandemic, and that it will have new soft power credibility around the world, which will contribute to a tipping point in assuming global leadership. And number three, that the pandemic and responses to it, such as the breakdown of transnational supply chains, tightened border controls, paranoia about infection, and so on, will mean a retreat from neoliberal globalization and cosmopolitanism and transnational cooperation more generally. So I'm going to take each of these claims one by one. The first claim is basically about economic weight. And essentially it's saying that this crisis is knocking the West down a peg and will hasten retreat of American leadership. Now, in my view, this is the most muddled of the 3 claims as an empirical matter and as a causal matter. I think it's certainly true if you take a long-term view that Western economic dominance is gradually receding. This is a natural trend over many decades as other parts of the world develop. But I think the pandemic at most is going to be a short-term blip on that trajectory, because in itself, it is a relatively one-dimensional and short-term disruption. There is a clear light at the end of the tunnel once the pandemic ends. Now, that is not to say that there is not going to be plenty of short-term unemployment, a lot of businesses going under, and maybe some less viable market niches will have their demise hastened by this. But we should not underestimate the agility of open market economies to come surging back and adapt as they have in other sharp recessions, which have had various causes in the past. Having said that, I would add one caveat, namely that political temptations to respond to a short-term economic crisis with bad policy can impair that agility somewhat. We saw that in various ways in the 1930s and 1970s, but in general, relatively dynamic Western economies have been through that kind of crisis before. And one crucial difference from China is that the West does not have all of its eggs in one basket, in the sense that Western economic policy is actually made up of multiple countries which are pursuing somewhat different tactics in dealing with this. So in a sense, if China fails in its response to the pandemic economic crisis, that is one case, whereas you would need multiple Western countries to fail at the same time for aggregate Western power to decline markedly as a result. But when it comes to this kind of political response to short-term economic pressures, I think it also is worth noting that the kind of protectionism that Donald Trump and those like him find tempting is not a political consensus. It may very well be reversed in the next election or the one after it. It also does not seem to have impressed many other Western countries as well. And I suspect that in looking at this crisis and how it unfolds over the next year or two, the countries that let that process run its course without hampering their own market's adaptability are actually more likely to get back to that longer term trajectory sooner. So if this first claim is about the economic weight of the West, then the second claim is about soft power. Namely, it's the credibility of the Chinese political model. Now, we do see this narrative that China has done a much more effective job in suppressing coronavirus in contrast to dithering in the US and some other countries. As an empirical claim, I think this is only going to be fully tested over the next year because we simply don't know how the pandemic will unfold in coming months and who will be shown in the end to have performed best. Still, there is obviously no denying that this is the story that Beijing is telling and that some people believe can be an inflection point for its ambitions. But I think that narrative about the success of the China model depends on a kind of tunnel vision. It depends on narrow comparisons with an unflattering image of the US and, frankly, some wishful thinking. It's not at all clear that Beijing is actually any more able to close the deal with the rest of the world, so to speak, than it has been in recent years. And if we see just in the last month or so, the backlash in Africa against xenophobia in China, the misgivings about debt burdens in the Belt and Road countries, all of these different reactions around non-Western parts of the world certainly don't suggest that perceptions of the Chinese model are shifting in a markedly more favorable direction. What I think is far more likely is that in moments of stress, people actually notice the worst of each system rather than the best. So in the case of the US, there's been a lot of attention paid to American inequalities, patchy healthcare, and the sluggish institutional response. At the same time, I suspect that the harder nationalism of China and the tendency of state to ride hard over society in China have also been illuminated and will continue to be illuminated. The example of Hong Kong was mentioned, and I think that this is a case in point. It's true that the distraction of the pandemic makes this encroachment on Hong Kong more possible, but it's also revealing that Beijing chose to wait for a moment of relative distraction around the world rather than pursuing its aims with the world paying full attention. So it certainly doesn't look as if this narrative of the Chinese model being especially well suited to new challenges is really gaining ground around the world any more than it was a year or 2 or 5 years ago. Here, though, as with my first point, I'll add a caveat, and that is that if there is any shift going on in the appeals of different political and social models, it's not going to be because of any short-term power shift or what those in Beijing might be tempted to imagine about their own performance. Rather, I think we do see signs that some segments of Western educated opinion are a little more comfortable with tighter regulation and the power of experts and the power of the state than they used to be. And it's certainly imaginable that their children and grandchildren might be one day, maybe not more Chinese by disposition, but at least more Singaporean by disposition, so to speak. And I think there's also a kind of loose elective affinity in the West between some social blocs that might want to see a bigger role for the state and the same social blocs that might want to salvage a certain mode of engagement with Beijing. But even though all of those broader, longer-term patterns may be true, that isn't because of the pandemic. I think that's because of much longer-term changes in socialization and attitudes towards hierarchy and enlightenment and expertise and bureaucracy and so on. And most importantly, I think if there are these temptations in the West for a different kind of social and political model, they may not actually be that broad-based in their support. These kinds of tendencies are very much contested in Western political cultures, and even among those who do support a shift in the Western social and political model over the long term, that may not lead to them welcoming a Beijing-centered world order anyway. This brings us to the third point about a supposed retreat of neoliberal globalization. I think it's true that this crisis showed a lot of protectionist measures and disruption of supply chains and the temporary closure of borders. And even if one doesn't buy the idea that America's influence is being significantly hit by the pandemic or that China's credibility is increasing because of how China is handling it, I think there are quite a few observers who at least think that globalization in general is in retreat, that public opinion is retreating into a kind of nationalism. We've already seen elements of this with Brexit and the Trump presidency and various other populisms. There's also, I think, a perception in some quarters that somehow the last generation of free trade and capital flows and somewhat freer movement is being reversed. There are undoubtedly quite a lot of nationalists who relish the idea of experiments like the European Union breaking apart under pressure and who would not want to waste a crisis in re-erecting walls around the nation state. I think it's also undeniable that if the world did go in a more nationalistic direction, with societies more contained within national borders, that would be more congenial to those in Beijing who worship at the altar of sovereignty. But having said all that, empirically, I don't see any real indication that trade and flows of capital and mobility of people will not resume as soon as feasible, or perhaps with some new patterns. Indeed, I think it's quite remarkable that compared to a lot of crises in the 20th century, how open things have actually remained the last few months. So it can be easy to hear the loudest and the most nationalistic voices around the world, but we should not ignore the large and growing constituencies that globalization has created in many countries. And what I'm seeing in Europe right now, for example, in media coverage and conversations, is that there is quite a growing apprehension about too much economic dependence on Beijing and various pressure points that Beijing has acquired in Europe and elsewhere. But there's also an upswell of demand from below for reopening borders for travel and cross-border business among countries with similar epidemiological conditions. So I think that rather than a kind of general retreat from globalization and openness, we're seeing more of a critical selectivity about the kind of engagement that's emerging. And it can be misleading to see reservations or hedging on certain relationships as a general retreat from openness in principle. There are a lot of misleading narratives floating around right now. You have nationalists and protectionists of various stripes who would like to have less openness overall, and then they highlight specific problematic relationships such as those between the US and China as a justification for that broader agenda. And on the other hand, you have those who want to maintain one or another kind of tilted or uncritical engagement, such as that between the US and China, who protest that any critique of its terms is by definition a retreat from openness in general. I think neither of those ways of talking about it really have to be true. If you want genuine openness, you may actually need to be more insistent on the conditions for it, and you may need at the same time to be more selectively enthusiastic in your cooperation with partners who also want genuine openness. So I think if we go back to the longer term time horizon that I've tried to highlight here, if you look at things like the demographics around the world, if you look at the countries with growing populations, the younger cohorts in the world who have fairly strong cosmopolitan sentiments, then it actually seems those trends are likely to continue gaining ground rather than retreating. Again, if we look at the longer term rather than short-term pressures. So I mean, overall, the argument that I'd make is that we shouldn't exaggerate what the pandemic is doing on its own. A lot of the more wild-eyed claims about its significance are either seeing short-term disruption and losing sight of those longer-term structural trends, or they're seeing things that the pandemic is merely illuminating or accelerating slightly as being caused by the pandemic. And I think those two kinds of mistakes make up at least 80% of the story that we often hear at the moment. Having said that, where does this leave US-China tensions? I think, generally speaking, it leaves them in more or less the same place that they were a year ago. The picture is dark on the whole, but there is a glimmer of hope. I think it's dark because the reasons for those tensions are quite fundamental. Contrary to what some say, those tensions are not going to be solved by better understanding or a few compromises or accommodations here or there. The pandemic is not causing any processes of disengagement or recalibration that were not already well on the way a year or 2 or 5 years ago. Those tensions, I think, are inevitable given the starkly different political systems and the extent to which the national identities of both America and China are so invested in ideas of global hegemony. I think this would perhaps not be quite as irreconcilable if a Beijing-centered world order would not change the fundamental conditions of liberty around the world. It would also be not so irreconcilable if Westerners were more psychologically prepared to accept that any future world is no longer going to be centered on the West, but rather much flatter and much more diverse. Those very different conditions, I think, seem very hard to achieve at the moment, but the hopeful part of this is that both of those elements are possible. And I think this is perhaps where some of the short-term experience of the pandemic may bring a kind of hope amid the disruption. It might bring some hard questions onto a more visible plane. So, for example, a slowdown of growth in China may actually bring out some of the social and political pressures that have been building up for a long time. It may contribute to shifting many people's aspirations in China from ever more accumulation to better predictions of human dignity. After a certain gnashing of teeth, that may actually end up making the China model itself something less peculiar and less ominous to the rest of the world. At the same time, the global scope of the pandemic and the awareness among a lot of people that this is the first consciously global crisis in which we're all on the same side, more or less, it may actually prompt some broader swaths of Western public opinion to look beyond merely lashing out or managing relative decline. But here as well, in keeping with everything else I've said, I don't think the pandemic is going to do anything that would not already be happening slowly sooner or later for multiple other reasons. So I'll stop there, and I guess we can open up for discussion.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. It appears that we've lost a panelist, so there may be some technical difficulties, but we do have a number of questions. So why don't we start with, okay, there's a question from Yang Long to Dr. Arase.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I see it here. So, the question is, what can middle powers in the region actually do in this situation where both the U.S. and China are, not really providing answers for the region, as other powers, hope and expect them to do. So, one example is when the U.S. backed out of the, TPP 12, that initiative carried on, right, to produce the TPP 11, which, the largest economy there is Japan, but, is joined by others in the region. And that's a very important initiative for keeping, globalization and trade expansion going. And by the same token, India in its diplomatic outreach, for example, into Southeast Asia, with its BIMSTEC and Mekong River initiatives, can create connections and institutional realities that the great powers can either use or, channel through, or these institutional structures can actually be obstacles to them. And similarly in Southeast Asia, among the smaller countries, many of them are limited by the need to maintain solidarity with ASEAN, but if some of those countries, particularly the coastal claimant states, decide to get together and press their interest in the South China Sea independently of the Indo-Chinese members of ASEAN who aren't involved in these disputes, they may be more effective in influencing the situation. So there are a lot of things that that not just middle powers and small powers inside the region, but also outside the region can do as well. For example, if you looked at the news, the UK just proposed a collaborative 5G initiative involving the G7 countries to work collaboratively to construct their own 5G network based on their own technology. So, in other words, these smaller powers and middle powers have an ability to change things, to change realities.
I'd actually add an observation on that as well. I think this point about countries that are not the US and China and what role they can play in shaping the global architecture and shaping global norms is very important. If you actually look at the global demographics and the projections about the share of the global economy, I think there is too narrow a focus on the US and China or the West and China. I mean, the fastest growing areas of the world are in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, the Middle East, etc. And I think there has been not enough attention to that bigger question about what kind of global order, what kind of global norms we actually want to lock in. So anything that middle or smaller powers or other regions of the world through multilateral mechanisms can do to shape that narrative and to shape those rules, that actually could have a much greater longer term effect. I think there is a kind of tunnel vision both in the US and China on purely weighing power in the short term, and that's not what may end up shaping global architecture the most. Another point that I would make about that is if you're looking at the weight, the demographic and economic weight of China in the world, in some ways this may actually be the relative peak, not the absolute peak. Obviously, China will continue prospering, perhaps with some fits and starts along the way. But if you're looking at it as a share of the global economy, other areas, both in population and economic performance, are likely to outgrow China, relatively speaking, over the next 30 or 40 years. So that could lead to some reassurance in some quarters that China's weight in the world will not actually allow the imposition of norms that many regions find unwelcome. We can also find that it can create a kind of short-term temptation, right? If this seems to be the point at which China has the most leverage, then it can also lead to temptations to take action that could be somewhat rash to try and lock in norms that Beijing would want in the short term.
Wonderful. That was a great answer. We have another question from Suyu. She has a SciS MA, class of 2019. And she is asking, when is the next inflection point for US-China relations? And will the ongoing China-India border tension intensify evolving US-China relations? So I think building off this middle powers question, what is going on between China and India, and how is that influencing US-China relations?
Well, Trump offered to mediate the dispute, but his offer was rejected, and understandably so. The two sides, I believe, are able to manage their current border tensions. They're not armed clashes. They're just, physical fights between border soldiers, and that happens all the time on that border. So I wouldn't blow that out of proportion, but you have to put that conflict into the larger context of how China's pressing all the neighbors with which it has sovereignty disputes all at the same time to make a certain point. And that is that China's basic point here is that, look, we've recovered from COVID-19 and we're ready to go, and the US is nowhere around to help you, okay? So I think this is kind of the subtext of their behavior, and I think it's going to backfire. I think it actually is going to cause countries to back away from China more and actually want the US around more. So in a sense, China's behavior is self-harming I don't think it's really helping its cause. And as far as inflection point goes, the biggest one I can think of is the election, the presidential election, because if Trump is reelected, I think this is not going to be good news for China. So and then of course, following that, China will have its Central Committee plenary meeting, and then that should be watched very carefully to see how China reacts to that presidential election.
I would add on the election for a second, but I also want to apologize for disappearing for a few minutes. There was a power surge in my house. The router went off. I don't know what went on. So maybe the boys downstairs are doing something they shouldn't be. But I agree the next possible inflection point is definitely the election. And I think even before the election, the rhetoric from, I think especially the Biden campaign as well, I think will be very important to watch. We already sort of know what the Trump game plan is. But before Trump, there was a cycle where during presidential elections in the US, there'd be a lot of heated rhetoric about China, and then presidents would come into office, and much of that rhetoric would tone down and cooperation would right to the fore again. And I think a lot of people expect that with Biden, but I do worry that the rhetoric could become so heated in the next several months about China that Biden will have to sort of put out a very strong China policy that he might not be able to back away from. So I'm not sure that even a Biden victory would lead to a change in the US-China relationship, although I do think that it would lead to such a change in US global leadership probably that this would have carry-on positive effects on the US-China relationship as well. So just to add on there.
Thank you. I wanted to, there's another question actually that I wanted to, I'm glad you came back because that is for Dr. Bulman. It's from Ralph. And he asks, how are China's safety net programs dealing with the rise in unemployment? This is because you mentioned kind of unemployment and its impacts on China's system. And are there any lessons that could be learned from China for other nations?
So I think we're still following this, and there might be much better information later. I think short answer is that the safety net, in the last decade, China has put in a safety net at a speed at which the world has never seen. It's still lacking in a lot of areas, but it has been very impressive. That said, the major issue right now for the safety net is unemployment benefits. And I would say two things that we can see in terms of unemployment benefits in China. One is that the official unemployment rate is still 6%, right? So most people are not covered by official urban unemployment insurance. Most people that are unemployed right now are migrants who are expected to go home to rural areas. And I was trying to allude to this in what I talked about earlier, that in the past, 12 years ago, migrants, 20 to 40 million of them went home to rural areas and were able to farm the land and at least have some benefits by owning land. Now that's still the case to a large degree, but in the last decade, something along the lines of, it used to be that about 5% of rural land was rented out, and now there are estimates that that's as high as 40% or 50%. This changes very much the economic prospects for migrants that return home. So I think unemployment insurance has done nothing for them, and that's where I think the big risk of instability and economic harm is. I think the one thing that China has been experimenting with and will likely experiment much more with that the world can learn from in terms of response to the crisis are consumption vouchers. These make a lot of sense. They seem to have high efficacy. If you give people $1 and say you need to spend it in a week, you can get, it seems like the estimates on where this is done in Hangzhou and other places, that you can get spending of multiplier effect of about 4. I don't know how much you can trust the Alibaba data on all this, but it's been quite impressive. And I think other places need to start, places that need to boost demand where it's not really, we're getting back to work is one thing, but getting people to actually go out and spend again is key. These consumption vouchers, I think, will be followed elsewhere, especially if China ramps them up.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Lynn. I think this is a pretty relevant right now. Trump blocks visas for Chinese students with military ties. So what is the next step for the US government? Are they going to expel every student from a Chinese university? Or does that mean it's impossible or will be impossible for students to study technology in the US in the future? I think it's for the panel at large, but
I'll comment on that because the visa policy and how it's affecting student enrollment is something that I see certain preoccupations about in general. I mean, so far this has been fairly narrowly targeted. I mean, it's looking at people studying in specific fields and so on. And I think that there is a pretty substantial constituency in the US and other Western countries for maintaining the flow of Chinese students. I mean, they have been pretty vital to the finances of many universities. I don't think any across the board measure to restrict visa access for the bulk of Chinese students would get past pretty substantial lobbying and opposition from those constituencies. It is certainly possible for a time that there will be impediments to study in certain kinds of STEM fields that have national security implications and so on. I mean, this, I assume, also has an element of reciprocity about it. I mean, Chinese visa policy also is, tends to view certain kinds of foreign presence in China with suspicion as well. And I think this is inevitable when you have this kind of international tension. I mean, my suspicion at the moment is this will probably not affect the vast majority of students who wish to study there.
I don't have any more insights to add on that. I would say that the legislation from Wednesday, the proposed legislation from Tom Cotton and others, I don't think will go anywhere, but I think it is a sign of potential terrifying steps in the future. I mean, this legislation was meant to cut all STEM graduates from China. That's I think 14% of post-undergraduate students in the US are from China in STEM. It's a huge number. I don't think that it's happening anytime soon. I think there's a sort of there's posing legislation, not actual legislation that's meant to pass. But I also, I think we need to look to US historians of, xenophobic zeitgeists as they emerge in the country and how quickly things can change. And I do worry very much that things could change quickly as rhetoric heats up. So maybe there's because I'm sitting alone in Massachusetts rather than actually around people and around students. So I get caught in the bubble of the internet. But I do worry that opinions could shift really rapidly here.
So building on that, because rhetoric is such an important element of kind of all of the relationships between these two countries and globally, we have a question for the panel from Ahmed. Which side may want to carry it? I'm assuming that it is the relationship or the tensions to a level of the Cold War, and why? Why would one side want to do this versus not? And which side may be impacted more severely by an escalation to Cold War type decoupling or Cold War type bipolar world relations?
I'd make one brief observation, then maybe Professor Arase would want to comment on this too. I think that there can be a tendency when we're talking about this to talk about both sides, both the US and China, as undifferentiated collectivities who are sort of acting in a unified kind of way. I think, there are certain fault lines within each society and even within each political system over what the appropriate attitude towards the other side is and what the long-term interests of each country actually are. And I think that we underestimate the potential contestation over those longer-term visions at our peril. I mean, in the US, I think, and in the West more generally, I think there hasn't been this kind of serious discussion about what it is that the West actually wishes to stand for at this moment of transition in the world system. What exactly is it that the West is representing when it comes to its relationship with China and its view of China's rise in the world? I mean, certainly the Trump kind of approach is a very narrow and short-sighted perspective, looking simply at holding off Western decline and comparing weight with China. I think that broader debate about what the West actually wants to represent and what it's trying to accomplish, either by engaging with China or standing up to China on some things, that I think has not been worked through. I think the same thing is also true, maybe in less visible ways, in China. I mean, China is not a monolithic society or system. I think there are many segments of Chinese society that would actually prefer a more a less aggressive approach to the world and a more open kind of society. And I think that kind of fault line will become more important down the road as well. So I think that a lot of this depends on which set of views or which set of attitudes are actually driving policy in each country, and that may change over time too.
I would say that Professor Bulman should answer the economic question, but my sense is China would hurt much more economically. But as far as like why we're even moving in this direction of the Cold War, neither side really wants to have a Cold War. But the problem problem and the dynamic here is that, as a rising and ambitious Asian great power, China needs to change the status quo, and the US is the status quo resident power in the region. And so what China has to do is it has to push the US out if it's to achieve its ambitions to be the predominant Asian power. And so this is creating this dynamic that's leading us toward a Cold War. Though neither side wants it, this great power agenda, the way China's constructed it, because it didn't have to be this way, but the way China's constructed it is definitely driving us in this direction. And of course, the US is not going to just, leave because it's from Asia with all its economic interests. The Asia, the Indo-Pacific is the center of global growth for the next 2 generations. There's no way the US is not going to be a part of this. So, and unfortunately, this drive toward the Cold War is a byproduct of this. But David might want to talk about the economic consequences for both sides of a Cold War.
Well, I mean, I don't have too much to add. I think I would definitely agree that depending on what the economic aspects of the Cold War meant in terms of decoupling, in terms of bifurcation of technological standards, in the short term, I do think that China's economy would suffer much more. I don't think the Cold War would have the potential. I think, as I mentioned in the talk, I think China has a lot of economic vulnerabilities that it has to deal with, and a lot of domestic reforms that have to take place. Whether a Cold War makes those reforms less likely, I think is a possibility, and therefore makes medium and long-term growth in China also suffer. But that's not something I would bet on, and I think it's foolhardy of American policymakers to bet on that. And also, the goal of keeping China down, I don't think is going to pan out. So yes, in the short term, a Cold War I think would have a worse economic impact on China, but that's not a success, I think, from Cold Warriors in the U.S. And I do, with both Professor Arase's and Professor Webb's point, agree fully. I think on the one hand, it does look like there are events that neither side, if you can think of them as a unitary entity first, neither side wants a Cold War. But there are reasons that that a Cold War is arising based on domestic political concerns or some smaller interests that aren't really about a Cold War itself. And then, of course, I think there are disaggregated actors who do want a Cold War or do want more conflict in the relationship. This can be bureaucratic actors. This can be trying to get your budgetary revenue, your budget higher in the U.S. government. We've had op-eds now talking about the U.S. having to prepare for covert CIA action, a la the Cold War. Coming from, well, we don't need to talk about where these are coming from, but I think there are certain actors and certain organizations that will try to push for a Cold War for their own interests, and I worry that those could rise to the fore. But neither side as a whole wants a Cold War.
So maybe an unfortunate byproduct of special interests. Well, hopefully not. So there's another question that we have from Da, a Fulbright visiting scholar at SAIS. His question is, there is a concern now in China that the so-called trend, de-Sinalization, which I guess means globalization led by the US without China. So globalization minus China, is, for example, the US is trying to get the US companies out of China. What do you think of this? And is it possible to decouple from China in the short term?
No, it's not possible to decouple in the short term. It's possible to move towards more decoupling and more disconnection in the short term. We've already seen companies moving out of China even before the trade war. There's rising costs in China. There's reasons to leave China. We see also at the same time a lot more companies coming in. So I think it depends what companies are producing for. If they're producing as export processing for export to the US or elsewhere, or they're involved in supply chains for export elsewhere, we'll see a lot more of that movement out of China. I do think that will take place, especially as technology standards bifurcate, as I was saying. But most new investment in China, most new FDI in China is about the Chinese domestic market. And the Chinese domestic market is huge, and these companies want to be there. What this will mean in terms of US tax policy and repatriating money, et cetera, I think there's all sorts of complications that could lead to less investment coming in, but I don't think we're going to see decoupling to any major degree in the short term.
Okay, great. For Dr. Arase, there's a question from Matthew Jones. How effective will existing response of the Trump administration in punishing Beijing for its new Hong Kong national security law? It seems that these options will only isolate Hong Kong and only push it towards embracing Beijing. What are your views?
Well, the important point to note is that Trump didn't say anything specific about what the U.S. would do in retaliation for passing this national security law in Hong Kong. Now, I don't really think there's any danger of Beijing winning the sympathies of the people of Hong Kong here. The local population is alienated from Beijing, and in fact, the reason why I believe the reason why they had to move now, while the NPC was in session, was because there's a legislative election coming up in September, and there is a real possibility that the pro-democracy forces would actually, against the odds, because the system is weighted against them, but there's a real possibility they could have won a majority in the local legislature here. And to forestall that, they had the only technically legal way for China to forestall that would be to use the NPC to pass a law and decree it in Hong Kong while the NPC is in session. So I think that kind of explains the timing of this whole thing. But as far as punishing China, I think this is going to come in very measured and precise ways in the coming weeks and months in reaction to what China actually does in Hong Kong. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see, but I suspect they're going to try to be more surgical than using a blunt force attack against Beijing on this.
I have a question for Dr. Bulman. From Chi Xiang, could you elaborate more on what is the future of the BRI in light of current economic pressures?
I wish I could. I think part of the answer for that is just going to have to wait to see how bad the global economic recession is and how long it lingers for. I think the BRI has been put into the Chinese constitution that is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy. It can't go anywhere, right? You can't just say the BRI is done. I think last year already at the second BARF, right, the Belt and Road Forum, right? So I guess a little over a year ago, you saw a real switch in the emphases that Xi and the CPC was putting on the BRI, right? The BRI was meant to be responding to a lot of the concerns around the developing world in particular, but also the developed world in terms of what its priorities were and how investment would go forward. And I think that was a smart move and made a lot of sense in a pre-COVID, pre-economic recession world. Right now, I mean, and we look at the ongoing negotiations, which I haven't followed closely enough on G20 and private debt as well, and most countries rejecting this deal. China, of course, said it was involved, but also said that preferential loans from Exim Bank and from CDB would not be included at first. As I said in what I was talking about earlier, I think there's a huge cost to China for forcing countries to try to keep paying this debt and prioritizing it and not having debt forgiveness. Even just delaying for a year is not going to lead to a good reputation for China, and that itself would be difficult for China's banks. But at the same time, China is not financially in a very good state to forgive all this debt. So I think BRI will have to move forward. I think there's going to have to be sort of a deal in which, with most countries that China has that have too much debt and can't pay it off in the recession now, China will have to forgive part of that debt. And this will be really bad for China financially, but China really will have no choice. And hopefully, I think China's just hoping that the world economy turns a corner quickly. There's a V or even U-shaped recovery that it's not just an L-shaped recovery, right? And if that happens, then BRI will continue, but maybe it will be toned down and sort of more rhetoric, but less money.
Great, thank you. We have a question from HNC Professor Roger Raufer for the panel. Many believe that the creation of a green economy WRT, climate change needs will require a greater role for state-driven industrial policies. How would this affect the US-China relationship?
That's an economics question, Dr. Bulman.
I'll give it a whirl. It's not my area, but I don't know if I accept the premise or know what a greater role for the state is in this sense. I think there's clearly a greater role for the state. Whether there's a greater role for the types of interventions that China has undertaken, I'm not sure. I think there's, we see, for instance, in California, policies that are very different from federal laws in the US. You can have, and I wouldn't call those industrial policies to the extent that we see in China. You can use more tax-based incentives to switch towards the green economy rather than subsidies for the overcapacity that you see in solar panels and NEVs in China. In terms of what this means for US-China competition, is that what the further question was? I mean, I think this is a great question. I don't think that moving towards a green economy is going to require the US to move towards industrial policy and state-owned enterprises a la China. So I think more likely we're going to see increased competition over these emerging technologies than that we're going to see a sort of convergence of economic policies between the two countries.
So that's an interesting, there have been a couple questions that all seem to kind of be talking about, are China and the US becoming more similar, or are they becoming more different from, one person asks if, so one person asks if the different handling of the pandemic is only a sign of future growing challenges. A long list of these challenges, but do these demand a realignment of the socioeconomic system? Either, Dan asks, does America need to become more like China as an authoritarian system, or, but alternatively, does China need to become more like America? So are these two countries becoming more similar? Or are they further diverging?
I'd say that connects a bit with the point that I think I made briefly earlier on about the appeal of different social and political models. I mean, there is that saying that a good crisis should never be wasted. And I think that we've seen in responses to the pandemic, I mean, people who are, already pushing for one or another policy change are trying to find ways of linking it to the challenges of the pandemic. So, I mean, on the right, we see, those who want to, close borders, restrict migration, lash out in various ways like that. I mean, they're using the pandemic to justify that. You see people on the left arguing for a greater state role, everything from a single-payer healthcare system in the US to wealth taxes and the like. It's certainly possible that authoritarian or technocratic tendencies have been illuminated by this, and that, I mean, if you wanted to do a test in various countries that have had very tight lockdowns of how much the population is willing to put up with in terms of monitoring and restrictions and so on, I mean, this is an interesting kind of test case that we can see. I mean, you also see, people who are advocating certain policy responses to climate change are also, taking some satisfaction from the decline in emissions and even saying, well, this is nothing compared to the kinds of change in people's habits that will be necessary to accomplish the longer term goals that they have. I think one of the problems with this is that the backlash against some of these restrictions is actually being quite ill thought out or somewhat tangential. I mean, there's a lot of talk about economic damage. There's a lot of lashing out by people who basically say that they should be allowed to do what they want, should not need to, conform to these temporary public order measures for the sake of public health. But I think if there had been this more serious debate about, what ways you can protect liberty in a complex society in the long term, what the implications of some of these technologies are. I mean, if those who favor strong public health measures during the pandemic could also, make some concessions or indicate that they take seriously these apprehensions about the shrinking of vibrant free spaces in society and the shrinking of personal freedom with technocratic regulation and these various kinds of dystopian technologies, I think that actually would have gone quite a long way. Unfortunately, this is not a conversation which has been had, and it's possible a lot of the health monitoring apps and things like that that we see in China are here to stay and will be used for other purposes as well.
Great. Would anyone else like to speak on that question? If not, we have about 7 minutes left. So if anyone has any final questions, they're welcome to put them in the Q&A box. There is two questions that have come up. One from Harvey, an HSC student, and another from, sorry, there's a long list of questions. I'll just ask Harvey's question because it's useful, I think, for all of us as we continue to watch China and the US in this moment. And is generally, what milestones or what indicators can we be looking for to kind of gauge the China-US relationship? Is Donald Trump's Twitter account really the best thing to be watching, or should we be looking at signs of trade interregionally, increased movement of people? What kinds of milestones or factors are you looking at as you kind of continue to monitor the relationship between China and the US?
Well, I would say we mentioned one already, which is the fall election, presidential election, but I would watch very carefully how the rest of the world reacts to this sharpening conflict between China and the U.S. and China's rise. I just mentioned the UK has signaled that it's a backward step. They're turning away from Huawei and discussing or proposing a joint Western 5G network development project. In the case of Japan, for example, Xi Jinping's visit to Tokyo was supposed to happen in April, and it was postponed because of the virus. And then it was supposed to happen sometime in this fall. But now the ruling party in Japan just sent a letter to the Japanese Prime Minister telling him, please don't invite Xi because of what he's doing in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So, it's very important to realize it's not just between the US and China. Other countries in the world have votes too in all this. And so it'd be very important to watch how other countries like India and also the Southeast Asian countries and Central Asian countries, how they respond, because, for China to be successful in its rise to predominance, it needs followers. And if nobody's following it, it's very hard to see how it's going to succeed. So I would say watch very carefully what happens to the so-called bystanders, but I don't think they're really bystanders. They're participants in this whole contest.
Great. Why don't we just go through, because we're at the end, why don't we just have Dr. Bulman and Dr. Webb both comment on this, and then we'll say we had a good panel and call it a day.
Sure. I mean, I think if you're interested in short-term developments in the US-China relationship, sure, look at the Trump Twitter account. There's, of course, a lot of other things you can look at in the short and medium and long term in terms of where the relationship is going. One thing that I think is really important and gets beyond some of the noise is really what's happening in the Chinese economy and the Chinese political economy. I think that there's a tendency in the US, especially since Xi has come to power, to look at the Chinese economy and political economy as static, as, okay, now China is turned towards state capitalism and techno-industrial policy, and that's that. But if you follow the Chinese economy, it is changing all the time. It is not static. There are new regulations all the time trying to support private sector firms. Since the trade war, there's been 2 years of external liberalization that have been faster than anything we've seen since just after the WTO accession. So, I do think that future cooperation will depend on economic models that are at least rules bound. And right now the WTO is not doing that. And I think there are changes that are taking place in China that could feasibly make an international rules-based organization work again, whether that's WTO or something else. So I think watching where these developments go within China is really important, and it's not over, right? I mean, the new structural reform proposal that we've seen over the last 2 months, there's some people that think it's more rhetoric and is going nowhere, and there's some people who think that this is the most important thing we've seen, at least since the 2013, the third plenum, and probably since before that. So I think there's a lot of internal debate in China about where to take the economy, and that's really important to watch if we want to understand the prospects for future cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly agree with what both of my colleagues have said on this, that the reaction of other countries will matter greatly. I mean, obviously the TPP is one area, right? And if you look at other countries joining the TPP, if you look at other kinds of multilateral or bilateral trading relationships and how those circuits of economic interdependence, and particularly the rules around them, are being shaped over the next 5 years or so. I mean, one country that nobody's mentioned yet, I think, is Russia, right? I mean, a lot of Russia's alignment in the world depends on one personality, namely Putin. I mean, he will not necessarily be there for a very long time. So, I mean, it depends what comes out of Russia as well. That's a significant, very movable piece on the global chessboard. And obviously economic performance within China. I mean, a lot of these pressures are intensifying in various ways. And I suspect that there is enough social pressure building up in China that we may see interesting events over the next 5-year period or so, depending on how that plays out. But yeah, in the short term, I think the US election is the single discrete event which will shape some of this.
Wonderful. So that brings us to 11:30 when this we're scheduled to end. So I just want to thank the three of you and all our technical support in the background as well. And I want to thank all the attendees for coming. And it didn't really prepare closing remarks, but I would say that if anyone is interested in continuing the conversation, all three of they may hit me for saying this, but all three of the professors here do have email addresses and are very responsive for the most part to questions and inquiries. There were many questions that were not addressed. And so if you would like follow up and to continue for your own interest, feel free to reach out to any of them. And if you don't have their contact information, you can find me and I can help find them. With that, I'll end it. If anyone has any closing words, please say them, and then we'll say goodbye and have a wonderful Saturday morning or Saturday night, depending on where you are.
Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.